Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining the first day of ICGS 2023. We are very pleased. All of us are very pleased. And at the same time, we are truly thankful for the number of attendees that came to join us for this event. It seems that this year's theme, Performative Geographies, resonates in many ways in our respective disciplines, interests, and practices. It warms the heart to be able to interact with fellow researchers, students, and teachers, and to explore together the intersections of performance, power, space identity, and other important concepts that are central to our practices and influential to our engagements. While earlier in our first plenary, we had our presenter, Professor Johansson, who talked about the imagined geographies of violence emerging from deteriorization or deterritorialization of rap music. The speaker for our second plenary session, a distinguished academic who has contributed significantly to the translation of radical texts in our region, will be sharing his insights on the geographical imagination in translation through Rosihan Anwar's Indonesian translation of Jose Rizal's Mi Ultimo Adios. I'm Oni Martinez, and I will be here to moderate this session and at the same time to introduce Professor Guillermo, or Sir Bowman to many of us here in the Zoom room. He is the director of the Center for International Studies, or CIS, at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. He was the faculty regent of the University of the Philippines from 2019 to 2020. He is also one of the initiators of the Network in Defense of Historical Truth and Academic Freedom. His current research projects are on the transmission, dissemination, reception, and translation of radical texts and ideas in Southeast Asia using techniques and approaches from translation studies and digital humanities. Here with us this afternoon to expound on the concept of gestor. I hope, Sir Bowman, I pronounced it correctly. Forgive me if I did not. So let's all welcome to our virtual podium, Dr. Ramon Guillermo.
Ayan, maraming salamat, Oni. Okay ba yung audio ko? Can you hear me? Can the audience
hear me? Yes, sir.
Okay, so thank you sa ICGS for this gracious invitation. And thank you for thank you to all the organizers. And initially, I was sort of apprehensive about talking about geography being not being very good at finding my own way around. Pero when I saw the title Performative Geographies, like Professor Martinez said, I thought it was something that I could wrap my head around. And I think I looked at the titles of the papers and of the panels, and I thought that that these are very interesting new ways of looking at the geographical imagination. So thank you for inviting me to this conference, and I hope I can share something that's interesting. I will do my best to try to engage with this general topic. I don't have any PowerPoint, but I will just be typing in some words so that we can get the correct spelling of some of the words that I will try to pronounce, like Oni said. So I'll just begin. This is not going to be a very long paper, but I'll try to make it as something that we can grasp and remember, at least, because that's the most important thing. So I want to go into first into Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher and literary critic who invented the word Jetztzeit, right, to describe the collision of the present and the past. So I'm going to type here that word, Jetztzeit, so we can see it. So you can see it in the messenger and the message. That's the message for everyone, right? So that's Jetztzeit. So I just separated the two words because this is a typical German compound word, which is made up of two elements. Now we know that German is like that it can't have very, very long words because it just adds up all of these nouns, etc., and makes it very long. This is not a very long word. It's just Jetztzeit. And it just means that Jetz means now, and sight means time. So sight, so you probably heard of the word zeitgeist, right? So that is, that was borrowed in the English language. So sight, and then we have Yeats, sight. So a literal translation would be, as it is generally translated in the English translations of Benjamin's work, is now time. So if you want to look at Benjamin's discussion of this concept, you can look at his short essay, the discussion on the concept of history, right? The concept of history. So you can look that up. This is said to be a very difficult essay to understand, but that's, I think, in general, that's how Benjamin writes. Almost everything that he wrote is so difficult to understand. But, so I've been thinking about this, and maybe I have come to some kind of understanding of what Yeats' sight is. So it's like, as I said earlier, it describes a collision between the present and the past, where we are now and the past. And this collision generates something like a shock among those who experience it. It sort of allows us to, it changes the way we think, this shock about things and about the world. Now Benjamin says that some events in the past are saturated by or loaded with Yeats' sight. Loaded. Geladen, that means it's load in German, it's geladen mit Yeats' sight. That means it's loaded, it's heavy with Yeats' sight. So some events in the past are heavy with this Yeats' sight. What he means by this is that such events in the past, so if such events in the past, if and when they are recognized by someone living in the present, especially the radical historian who can construct such constellations in time, suddenly barges into and takes over the experience of the present. So what this means is that such events in the past suddenly barges into and takes over the experience of the present. So, a historian is in a good position to do this kind of juxtaposition of the past and the present, in which the past suddenly becomes as if it were in the midst of us, in the midst of our present, living in our present. It is as if the past takes over the present spectrally. Now, this is a term, spectral, a spectral takeover. The past undertakes a spectral takeover of the present. The person living in the present suddenly sees herself experiencing the present as if in the past. Now, this is so, I guess we're getting to the more clearer explanations here. Benjamin does not imply that the past and the present become conflated. What he is saying is that this collision between them generates a shock that raises the question of seizing time, seizing the time. That is to say, of seizing the opportunity opened up in the present in order to redeem the past. Benjamin, in elaborating on the concept of history, may have taken the place of occurrence of these events for granted, since he was much more focused on the gap in time between the past and the present. But what if his temporal distinction is translated into a spatial one? So we want to look, there's Yeats' sight, which proposes the collision of the past and the present. What if we translate this into a spatial kind of juxtaposition? Perhaps one can experiment with the concept of Yeats' Ort for this purpose. So I'll type in again Yeats' Ort. So Yeats' Ort. So we replaced sight with Ort. So Ort is place or space. So we're replacing it with now place. So perhaps for this purpose of translating a temporal distinction to a spatial one, we can experiment with Yates' or. This is similar to the compound Yates site, with the difference that site or time is replaced by ort, which means place, which can now be translated as now place. One can argue that this is not really, however, one can argue that this is not really correct, and that the more correct spatial analog to time would not be now place, but here place. In German, the rather awkward hier Ort, right? Here Ort. This may be correct. One could say, for example, that another place may be saturated with here, with something like here Ort. No, it's so awkward. However, an argument for Yates Ort it is that it, like Yates' site, can also be understood as a spatialization of time. In fact, Benjamin speaks of history as something which takes up or fills up a place. If Yates' site is related to the question, when are you now? When are you now? Yates' Ort relates to the question, where are you now? It is therefore the question of when and where you are now, Yates, that really matters. Another place that can be saturated with the now place, in the sense that that place is saturated with the reality of where you are now at this very moment. So Yates Ort speaks of another place which is saturated with where you are at this very moment. But like Yates' site, this spatial collision also creates a shock of recognition, where another place suddenly becomes present where you are now. Some of you may be familiar with Benedict Anderson's work on specter of comparisons, but this is a different experience from specter of comparisons. This latter specter of comparisons can be illustrated by the example of the botanical garden in Manila, where Ibarra in Noli Me Tangere, after having returned from Europe, suddenly sees the botanical garden in front of him, much loved by him during his childhood, filtered through the images of the more advanced and well-kept European botanical gardens. The view of the botanical garden has lost the innocence which his eyes had as a child. He therefore experiences the Manila Botanical Garden simultaneously with the spectral reality of other vastly superior botanical gardens. Both places collide in his consciousness, which generates a certain unease. So you see here that the idea of the specter of comparisons, which Anderson developed from Jose Rizal, can also be understood in a spatial way. That is, that one experiences one space while spectrally experiencing another space at the same time, which influences one's experience of both. However, the experience is somewhat there's a question there. It's Traum. Yeah, that's a good question. Let's go here to answer that. Yeah. Okay, let's go back to Yates' Traum. It's possible. So this experience is somewhat reversed in the phenomenon of Yates' Ort. So when we look at the specter of comparisons, that is something the reverse of Yates' Ort. In Yates' Ort, it is not the present place where we are which makes us recall another place. So that's in the case of the botanical garden, where Ibarra goes to the botanical garden and he suddenly, in his mind, remembers the more advanced, more beautiful botanical gardens of Europe and says, ang pangit naman ng ating mga botanical garden sa Manila. No? When in fact, he like it when he was a child. Now, this is different with Yates' Ort. It is rather that a mental picture of another place brings to in the specter of comparisons where we are gives rise to an image, a spectral image. Yates' or means that a mental picture of another place from where we are now, brings us back to where we are, to our own place. Comparisons with idealized mental images often results in the denigration of the reality of where you are. Right? So the specter of comparisons usually generates something like a critical moment, which is negative in form. For example, I always told my students about this specter of comparisons, that Rizal already discussed this in the very what do you call this? In the very dedication in Oimitange, where he discusses that, where he says that as he walks the cities of Europe, an image of his country rises in his mind, and he sees that his country is sick, has a cancer. So you can imagine, like, that is the experience of many Filipinos in the diaspora, of not like in the past, wherein only a few could experience this, the elite like Jose Rizal, but now we have a huge diaspora of Filipinos experiencing this, that while walking in the developed and advanced cities of the nations where they have found some employment, images of their nations rises in their mind and becomes a kind of spectral comparison with what they see while walking these cities. And then what arises in their mind is, ang pangit naman sa Pilipinas, ang gulo sa Pilipinas, ang sama naman ng ating transportation system, and all that. That's how the kind of spectral comparison operates. But the concept of Yates' sort is different. In contrast with this, the concept of Yates' sort describes how an image of another place allows us to see the explosive potential of our location in the here and now. So it describes the Yates' sort, similar to Yates' site, describes how an image of another place allows us to see the explosive potential of our location in the here and now. If, according to Benjamin, the revolutionary task of a historian is recognize and transmit liberative forces slumbering in the past to emancipate the present, the task of the radical geographer is to recognize in the lived spaces of other places, in the past or present, emancipatory potentials for the struggles we face here and now. In light of this, Cuba, the names of nations, Cuba, Vietnam, South Africa, Palestine, are place names they are loaded with extraordinary meaning. These are not merely names of countries, but refer to places where some of the most difficult struggles against colonialism and racism have taken place since the second half of the last century. It is not for nothing that the name Vietnam is tied to Cuba, and that Cuba is tied to South Africa, and that South Africa is tied to the current conflicts in Palestine. It is no accident that apartheid South Africa is today constantly evoked with reference to Palestine. Palestine today is living the place where South Africa was before. A look at a map of apartheid South Africa leads to the shock of realization that Palestine is also living in apartheid. So you can actually see maps in the internet. I could have downloaded and shown them to you, but you can actually see the internet maps which compare apartheid, the process of enclosures and apartheid in South Africa, and what's happening in Palestine, to show you spatially and geographically how apartheid is implemented and how it exists in the present in Palestine, and how the reality of the past reality of South Africa reflects this current reality of another place. So it's a kind of shock when you look at the map of South Africa, and then you look, and then an image of the map of Palestine you see another image of the map, and you see there is a moment of recognition where another place evokes the experiences of another place. Despite all of its contemporary travails, the image of the South African people rebelling against apartheid is an emancipatory force, which is now playing out in Gaza and in the West Bank. No matter how desperate the situation is today, the spectral image of the determination of Mandela's people and their victory against a particular oppressive system continues to give hope to the Palestinians. So we see here a kind of convergence of Yeats' site and Yeats' org, in a way. On the other hand, we also see in the internet today maps comparing the territorial marginalization of Native American Indians in the USA and of the Palestinians in Israel, which in turn generates the realization that settler colonialism is operative in both places. The Palestinian struggle, for its part, reactivates or also gives life to the struggle of Native American Indians. That the Palestinian struggle today exists is in itself a form of redemption and recognition for the defeated and annihilated tribes of the Americas. So you can also see maps comparing the reservations of American Indians and how they've been marginalized when the whole of the Americas used to be their own place, and now they live only in these very small reservations, practically wiped out as a population in what used to be their own land. And you can also see this in the independence struggle of Hawaii, another nation which was really in a very sneaky way states. So the original Hawaiians are marginalized to the less wealthy, whereas the more fertile, the richer islands, they belong to the what you might call the settlers, right? So now we go back to the Philippines. The Philippines once also played a similar role, and in this particular case, I want to discuss the role of the Philippine spatial imaginary in the Indonesian War of Independence of 1945 to 1949. So here we go to some kind of Philippine-Indonesian relationship. This relationship is strikingly illustrated by the 1944 translation into Bahasa Indonesia of Jose Rizal's poem, Mi Ultimo Adios. So you think that Jose Rizal's poem was extremely, contextualized in the Philippines. Of course, it has so many translations in so many languages. But this particular translation is quite interesting because it also this poem played a role in another revolutionary process. Rosihan Anwar, the translator of the poem, of Jose Rizal's poem into Bahasa Indonesia, said that he did not intend a literal translation, but rather tried to translate the sense and the spirit. So in this sense, in this way, he rather tried to get what was meaningful for Indonesians, tried to get the spirit of Rizal's text. So if you actually compare the Indonesian translation with the original, or even with the English translations upon which Rosihan based his translation, or even with Bonifacio's translation into Tagalog, you will see that the Indonesian translation is very much shortened, and also that it takes some liberties with the text itself. But I think for Rosihan Anwar, that was the way in which the power, the energy of Jose Rizal's poem could be transmitted or transferred from one revolutionary process to another revolutionary process. Though Jose Rizal's poem takes place in a specific spatial context, this does not mean that this spatiality is untranslatable. Now, if you read Rizal's poem again from a spatial perspective, you'll see it's so rich in spatial metaphors, but we will only deal with a few or just one or two spatial metaphors because it's so rich in this. Maybe someone else can go into that of the specific spatial imaginary of Mi Ultimo Adios. In the poem, the Philippine Revolution of 1896 occurs in the place called Patria, in Spanish, or fatherland. Patria, in Rizal's poem, was translated into Tagalog by Andres Bonifacio as Bayan. Bayan is quite unique in that it is not only associated with place, but also quite strongly and directly with people. People. Similar to pueblo in Spanish or folk in German, which is not the case with patria. So patria is really very much related to nation and not very much with the people. But bayan or pueblo or folk in German, they all refer to the people. On the other hand, Rosihan translates the word homeland from the English translation of Jose Rizal's poem, which served as the basis for his translation, with the Malay phrase tanah air. So I just type it. So it's here. Yeah, so I typed in the message box tanah air. So that's how Rosihan translated the idea of homeland, or just looking at the relay, patria, homeland, bayan, and then we have tanah air in Bahasa Indonesian. So this is quite an interesting concept. It's also interesting because it's like German, which you just add two words together, and they become a different concept. So the phrase tanah air is said to have been first used in reference to the Indonesian nation by the poet and historian Muhammad Yamin in 1922 in a long poem of the same name. Tanah means land, while air means water. So this is quite confusing. Air, which looks like air, means water in Malay or Bahasa Indonesia. So if you go to, for example, to a gas station in Jakarta and you see air, that's not air, that's water, right? So quite confusing. But tanah air therefore means land, water. It's a kind of combination, land, water. This phrase has become so important in the Indonesian Malay and the Malay national or nationalist imaginary. It appears very prominently in the Indonesian national anthem in the phrase, Indonesia, tanah airku, my tanah air. Its emotive force in the Indonesian context and in other Malay-speaking countries is similar to that of Inang Bayan in Tagalog. It is defined in the Standard Dictionary of Bahasa Indonesia as negeri tempat kelahiran, or the land of one's birth. However, it's really quite a unique idea. Such a conception of homeland, as some have also pointed out, is unique and points to the conception of the body of one's nation as being made up of land and water, which is reflected in the Malay phrase tubuh tanah air. In other words, it is an archipelagic concept that powerfully resonates emotionally and intellectually in the present-day post-colonial Malayan archipelago, covering Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, also Singapore. In transporting Rizal's patria to Indonesia's tanah air, the geography of Philippine anti-colonial struggle of 1896, as it is portrayed in Mi Ultimo Adios, seemingly shifts to Indonesia in 1944. And also, incidentally, it feeds back into a conception of the Philippines as being an archipelago itself, as well as the possibility of it being a part of the larger Malayan archipelago. In fact, the Indonesian national anthem, which is named Indonesia Raya, Indonesia Raya used to mean larger. It means larger Indonesia, but there were definitions of Indonesia Raya which included the Philippines and Malaysia. But today, of course, this is no longer the case. But it's quite interesting that Tanah Air, in using Tanah Air for the Philippines, Rosihan Anwar also seems to go back to that older conception of the Philippines as being a part of the Indonesian Malayan archipelago of the Nusantara. Actually, Nusantara means archipelago. So Indonesia became quite unique in developing a concept of their nation, which is not just a translation of the Western idea of nation, patria, homeland, etc. Something that really reflected their reality as a very large archipelagic entity. Now, another displacement is Rizal's image. Another displacement which happens in the translation is that Rizal's image of the patria supposedly attains its redención final, or final redemption. This final redemption is replaced by Rosihan with the phrase "Tengah menuju merdeka," which translates as being on the path of freedom. So I'll just type it. Randy types here island and archipelago. So that's precisely what we're thinking about. What the kind of contribution that Tanah Air brings into the conception of state, of nation states. It can't be a general description of all nations, because not all nations are archipelagos, but specifically it pertains to Indonesia and maritime Southeast Asia in general. So I just want to say that another word which appears in Rosihan's translation is merdeka. Of course, some of you know this. The merdekaan, freedom, right? So, but in Rizal's poem, it's not freedom. It's not a nation on the path to freedom. It's a nation on the path to redemption. It's kind of more religious, more biblical idea. But by putting such words as merdeka and Tanah Air together in his translation, Rosihan is able to effectively create the shock of recognition on the part of his Indonesian readers that in translating a poem from the Philippine Revolution of 1896, he is also writing about the Indonesian struggle for independence at the same time. In other words, the Philippines of 1896 is saturated with the Yeats Ort and also the Yeats site of Indonesia of 1944, which its nowness forcefully asserts itself, both in terms of Ort, space, and site. Here, one must emphasize that it is not only the case that the rage against the colonial oppressor and the capacity for sacrifice of the Filipinos of 1896 are passed on to the Indonesian revolutionaries by means of the translation of a poem. This is precisely what Benjamin thinks is important in the transmission of texts. It is not the propositional content. It is not the information in a text that is most important for Walter Benjamin. It is what he calls the craft, the power, the energy of a text. Just like the rage, the anger against oppression, colonial oppression, and the capacity for sacrifice. These are the things that ought to be transmitted by this process of Yeats site and Yeats Ort. And not merely information that Filipinos were doing this at a certain date or time, that the revolution went through a certain process with some details. That's not the most important thing for Walter Benjamin. The most important thing is this passing on of this energy, such that the past such that another place lives on, regenerates itself, activates itself into the now, into the where we are. So it is not only the case that the rage against the colonial oppression and capacity for sacrifice of the Filipinos of 1896 are passed on to the Indonesian revolutionaries. Because at the time, Rosihan said that this translation of Jose Rizal's poem became somewhat popular, and it was printed in several pamphlets, several flyers, and that some of the Indonesians going to fight the Dutch were reading this poem before battle. So it had this kind of also effect. I can't really overestimate, or we can't really exaggerate this effect, but there is some testimony to this kind of effect. So, but another effect of this translation, which counterposes the struggle of Indonesia for independence, the struggle of Indonesia for independence also serves to retroactively redeem the Philippine Revolution defeated by US colonialism. The Indonesian revolutionaries leap like Benjamin's tiger into the sky of the Philippine past, as if to reenact or redeem the Philippine struggle, as if they were reinforcements from the future. So it goes both ways. Not only does the Philippine Revolution of 1896 give this kind of energy, powerful energy to the revolution of Indonesia, the revolution of Indonesia was also a process of winning the battles that the Filipinos lost in the past, of redeeming that defeated struggle, of picking up the ruins of that past in order to redeem it. So Benjamin referred to this process as something like a tiger, as I said earlier, a tiger that jumps into the past. And in Malay, of course, tiger is harimau, right? Harimau. So it's really a nice image of that harimau jumping into the past in order to redeem that past, while it is fighting for its own liberation in its own time. So you can see here that there is a kind of notion of praxis that evolves from this concept. Yeats' sight and Yeats' art are not merely intellectual or mental states. They're not merely emotional states experienced by the radical historian or militant geographer. Their most important aspect is the explosive energy they bring to people's movements seeking freedom from oppressive conditions and liberation from colonial and other forms of domination. These collisions of time and space, constructed and devised by historians and geographers, are to be lived and acted upon, above all, by the agents of history. And this is why Benjamin says that the price to be paid for this knowledge can only be paid for very dearly. And so this is I think that's my talk. So it's an exposition of what Yeats' art how Yeats' art can be understood. And I went into the current example of the use of maps in the current Palestinian issue. And then we went to the speciality of Jose Rizal's poem and how this was translated into the Indonesian struggle for independence of 1945 to 1949. So thank you for listening, and I hope that was understandable enough and something that maybe we can think about and perhaps use.
Thank you so much, Professor Guillermo, for that thought-provoking talk and for sharing your insights about place juxtaposed with time and the kinds of spatial imaginaries that may emerge from conceptualizing and reconceptualizing identity and place in different contexts. And of course, the power and the affect of text and its capability to pass on and activate or reactivate not just feelings, but I guess commitments to particular emancipatory projects. And that really, here we can see how moving from text to space, to maps, to representations, which is something that is shared in common between, for example, in our practice, cartography and digital humanities. So I hope our students, especially my students, because we're also studying a lot about spatial representation, cartographic abstraction, would find some parallel concepts and ideas with what Professor Guillermo has shared with us this afternoon. And so, without further ado, let's now proceed with the open forum. And we're really hoping that our audience would also be sharing their insights or comments on the presentation of Dr. Guillermo. You may use the chat box for this, or better, siguro if we could express your thoughts through turning on your microphone and really starting this conversation. All right, so you may raise your hand, and maybe my colleagues can also help me recognize those who would like to ask questions in case I could not really see all of you.
Maybe you can answer the one about Yates Traum first, because there's a question from Vanessa Joy.
Yes, earlier.
About Yates Traum. So yeah, time and space generally in physics would be translated Zeitraum, or Einstein. No? When Einstein, Einstein wrote his stuff in German originally. So space-time would be continuum, would be Raum, Zeit, continuum, right? So that's how in physics it would be expressed. But I think although Zeit is generally used in parallel with Raum, I think the advantage of Ort is that it pertains to a specific place immediately, right? That particular Ort, that particular place, I'm talking about that Ort. But Raum generally is space, is the whole space that we are in. And that's a bit more, we might say, abstract than Ort. And it's also a bit more amorphous than Ort, because Ort would refer to a specific place. For example, when we talk about South Africa, a specific place, and then compare it with another specific place like Palestine. These are Ort. They're not necessarily realm. Within them, there's a realm that you can move around. But when you talk about identifying a place, then that is realm. And also, maybe another use that may come to mind is the use of the Nazis of this space, of this concept of Raum, Lebensraum. So they justified their invasion of East Europe when they said that we want to expand our Lebensraum, our living space, right? Our living space. So that's a very amorphous thing. We will expand our living space indefinitely, and perhaps even to a global scale. So it's like stretching your arm or stretching your legs, and then you can get a larger realm. So I think the advantage of Ort, when we're talking about conflict and about this kind of contradiction, about this kind of juxtaposition of different places, then Ort might function a bit better than Raum. Although and Zeit, of course, it functions in the same specific way also, aside from being useful also in the more general and abstract way, just like Raum.
Thank you. Would there be other questions or perhaps comments on the insights shared by Sir Bowman? We also ask those who would like to ask questions to turn on their microphone. Other comments? All right, sir. Siguro ako. Is there someone who would like to speak? Sorry. Did I interrupt? Oh, yes. Sir, there was a comment earlier on island and archipelagic states in relation to Tanah R.
Mhm.
Would you like to also kind of elaborate on that in the context of archipelagic states and islands?
Well, the point of the Tanah Air was that when you translate patria as Tanah Air, is suddenly patria assumes another kind of reality, because patria doesn't actually contain Tanah Air, and you might say that not all nation states can be called Tanah Air, right? Because not all, I mean, landlocked, for example, nations can be called archipelagic in that sense. So, when the thing is, I think the critique of the Philippine revolutionaries of Western concepts was somewhat incomplete, because I think when they were thinking of Inang Bayan and those categories, they were actually translating from homeland, from fatherland, from motherland. So they sort of assumed the conceptual, let's say, integrity of the European conception of the nation state. And in a way, this European concept is what we might call terracentric. It's centered on as if everything in the world in history was happening on land. And they had a concept that events in the sea were somehow secondary, were not as significant as those events which happen on land. So this terracentric conception is a very European idea. So I think when the Filipinos were developing their concept of nation, and they borrowed this concept of patria or motherland or fatherland or other concepts, they did not develop a more original concept of the constitution of what their nation would be. Unlike the Indonesians, who sort of out of the blue came out with their Tanah Air, right? Which is a different conceptualization and contains the reality of their national territorial configuration. It describes the importance of both land and water understood together. So I think the Indonesians were able to formulate something that was more, let's say, a more original or a critical formulation of what their nation is. And the most fascinating thing about this is how Tanah Air acquired an emotive significance among them. It looks like simple, like Tanah and Air together, but it attained a kind of forcefulness in terms of the emotion, in terms of the associative wealth of meaning that it gives rise to among Indonesians, and also the Malay. Because if you look at Singapore, if you look at Brunei, if you look at Malaysia, they all use Tanah Air now. And even in their national anthems, you will see Tanah Air. So this indicates a notion of their nation as very deeply archipelagic, and that there is the archipelagic consciousness in this. So when you translate, when Rizal's poem was translated into Indonesian, it suddenly began to assume this kind of archipelagic imagination in translation. And therefore, when that happened, Indonesians reading this translated poem would suddenly feel that the Philippines, or that they would feel, firstly, that the Philippines was also a tanah air, and secondarily, that what they're reading is not about the Philippines, but actually about Indonesia and about the Malay archipelago. Because tanah air is hardly used to refer to other nations by the Indonesians and by the Malay. It is highly specific to what they are. It's almost like a name of their own country, a nickname of their own country. So, that's how this translation sort of takes away this poem away from us and begins to be imagined spatially as an Indonesian one, right? So that's how interesting this kind of reformulation is of the nation state. So today we're struggling with this kind of archipelagic consciousness. We're trying to figure out concepts and theories which can allow us to grasp better the archipelagic reality of the Philippines, also linguistically, which is very important. But we are just at the beginning of this process of reading ourselves of these uncritically absorbed concepts of national territory that we have just borrowed from European models.
In relation to that, sir, what would you think would be, or what would be your suggestions on the ways in which we can somehow better, go into that direction of reimagining our nationhood or being a nation in a decolonized manner? And what are the ways in which, for example, the university, how will it play a role into this? Most especially, I think, not just at the level of higher education, but maybe even at a younger age. What are the prospects for the Philippines with respect to higher education?
Bigat naman ang tanong ni Mami. Of course, our education system is not completely liberated from the schemas and models that we have inherited. I'm not saying that we should completely reject what we had in the past. It's just a matter of trying to figure out how to better express our realities using concepts and theories which are what, according to the language they use, more appropriately grounded or not, because grounded is actually a non-archipelagic idea, but grounded in this archipelagic reality. Also, the many other realities that we face in our country. Now, the problem with earlier with the spectra of comparison that I mentioned earlier is that, and that Benedict Anderson developing from Rizal, is that it sort of, when for example an OFW walks around London or New York, and then the specter of Manila or Quezon City or Davao or Cebu suddenly rises up in his or her mind, and that usually happens in a way that denigrates the Philippine reality, in a way that hardly questions the how fit, for example, the solutions and the concepts used in the West, or the policies that they have to address their own issues. You hardly look at how fit these are to apply to our own conditions. So I think that that's the specter of comparison is productive in a way because it generates a critical position. But if you don't move beyond the specter of comparison and always say, nah, in the Philippines, we're not doing it properly. In the Philippines, everything is so bulok, rotten. Everything's not working. It's so inefficient. In comparison with the realities that we see in other places, then maybe that's an initial critical position, but we have to also go beyond this so that we can have a productive way of dealing with our reality. So Yeats' Ort, in a way, tries to get energies from the past, from our own history, so that we can solve the problems of our present condition. So I think one way to answer your question is to have a greater sensitivity to the implications of the specter of comparison, and to try to develop the technique of Yeats' Ort and Yeats' Sight, so that we can find solutions, the energy for the solutions for our present problems, and to talk about these solutions among ourselves, so that they can become acceptable to us. So I think, well, that's a very complex and very broad issue, but yeah, I think that's one way of looking at the problem. It's just that, many of even our own formulation of our own nation is not emancipated itself from the strictures of European models, which may not be appropriate. And that also goes for the question of language, for example. Linguistic diversity in the Philippines is not properly dealt with if you just copy the models of the nation states in Europe. So we have to look for our own solutions in terms of linguistic diversity in the Philippines. So, but of course, you see Indonesia also had its own solution, which is a very successful one, but also created its own problems. But generally, it is something that cannot be rolled back. Now, this great success of Bahasa Indonesia in Indonesia.
Sir Bowman, we're down to our last question.
Okay.
What is the closest local concept to Tanah Air that we can use to reflect on our diversity and archipelagicness and nationalist sentiments? This is not to be descriptive or restrictive, but something where we can build from as we think about love and loyalty to the land and connections. So,
well, napakahirap naman. That's so hard to think of. Yeah, no. So I can't really think up of anything now that because it would be somehow artificial also if I think up something that would be similar to Tanah Air, because Tanah Air is something that, like a concept that grew up or developed within the Indonesian discourse, within a kind of process of evolution of the national awareness and language in Indonesia, and became embedded, in a way, very powerfully embedded into their discourse, for good or ill. It became powerfully embedded in it. But it actually began as a title of a poem by Muhammad Yamin in 1922, and then sort of got immersed in several other usages, and got caught up in this powerful nationalist movement. So I think even though it shows us, it demonstrates a real originality of thought, which is also reflected in other aspects of Indonesian national construction, like Sukarno's Pancasila, for example. No matter how critical we may be of contemporary formulations of Pancasila, it was still an effort to develop a kind of national perspective. They call it ideology, which may be difficult, right? But they were in search of originality in Indonesia, actively in search of originality. Their leaders, their thinkers, their writers were in search of ideas which would be more reflective of how they thought and how they felt and of the realities. And I think this can only be approached, I think, from the point of view of, let's say, of a lively living discourse and dialogue among Filipinos to develop of all sectors, to develop this kind of thinking, to develop a more emancipated and liberated way of looking at our problems and of solving them. So I don't think I can answer that. I can say that, what is the Filipino equivalent of Tanang Ayam, because this concept developed in a very complex space of nationalist struggle, and I think only something that arises in a similar process could be accepted in the Philippines. So I know that that's not really a good answer, but maybe you could think up of something. But at least for me, it's important that it comes from us. It comes from a discourse, from a dialogue of original thinking in the Philippines. Yeah, so here is a long comment.
Sorry, sir, I was muted. So there's a comment. I think that what also adds to the complexity of the specter of comparison is the global hegemony that overly emphasizes EU models, those soft power and global alliances that overhaul space decisions and solutions add into the different factors of classicism. So instead of collaboration to aid the Philippines in generating appropriate solutions for national problems, EU models are taken in exchange for monetary benefits. In a way, the specter of comparison is intertwined with complex circumstances, and it's true in the political landscape in the Philippines.
Yeah, good statement.
It's a good
Salamat,
comment.
Mr. Aragones.
All right, so okay, I noticed that there was a question just posted just now, Sir Bowman, in the Q&A box. If you could read it from there. This is the last question. So it's in the Q&A box. It says here, it's interesting to know that translation can be a process in literature to grapple the idea of spatialization of time and event culture, such as the Philippines and Indonesia, and the concepts of freedom and homeland from both nations. Thank you for introducing just that and just all in Rizal's poem. And since we are thinking about the time now and the space here and out there, can you also observe just time and just all on the diasporic literatures written in their regional language and in the English language? And could there be distinction in imagining the homeland between migrant who writes on the local language and another who writes in a different language or in English? That's a quite compounded question, I think. But well, the main question is, I think, the second part.
Can you repeat the main question? Because it doesn't show up in my...
Oh, I'm sorry. Can we also observe the jet site and jet sort on the diasporic literatures written in their regional languages and in English language? So do you think that there would be a distinction in imagining the homeland between a migrant who writes in the local language and another who writes in English?
Migrant who writes
in the local language and another who writes in English. Imagining the homeland.
Where is the migrant? In abroad?
Yeah.
Migrant abroad. Right. Yeah, that would be quite interesting. Yeah, if you have more migrant Filipino or OFW migrant writing, that would be a rich source of, I think, of spatial and geographical ideas, since they live, they are in general, their lives are mobile in a way, and they are living in a different space from which they came from, or living in different spaces from which they came from. So I think that's one aspect that I think Filipino migrant writing should be very interesting in terms of studying them in terms of the spatial categories, and I think they would be rich in terms of this. But one thing I noticed is that travel writing is actually different from migrant writing, right? One thing I noticed, because when I was thinking of this, I wanted to look at travel writing. Travel writing is usually burgis, burgis. The people who have money who can travel to different places, and then they describe their travels, the different kinds of transportation that they take, the places that they go to, the restaurants that they eat in, the monuments that they go to. So these are travel writing. Many of these travel writings are generally burgis. They come from the upper classes. But the writings of the OFWs, they may have something to do with travel. They may have something to do with adjusting to new spaces and places, but not in the way that they don't discuss travel and mobility in the way that the burgis discuss this. So there's a distinction between that kind of potentially very rich OFW writing and also the so-called travel writing. And I think OFW writing is more interesting in a way than the burgis style. Secondly, I think if they write in different languages, in their own languages, then that would also be a rich source of looking at how spatial categories are used in their own different languages in the Philippines. So it's sort of boring if we just write in the major languages in the Philippines, or the language which most people speak, like Filipino, Tagalog, or Ilocano, or Cebuano. If you look at other languages dealing with this kind of spatial dislocation, new experiences in new places, then I think this would be rich sources mainly, I think, of the specter of comparison, because while they're living in another place, spectral images of their origin, of their region, arises in their mind. So that's what makes it important, that it's not indeterminate. Like you're living in, for example, in Kyoto, for example, and then images of La Union rises in your mind. So it's not indeterminate, like Manila or Philippines. It's not indeterminate. So there's always that interesting factor of the specificity of this experience that could be probed further. I think that's a good idea to look at these writings in the different Philippine languages to arrive at kind of way by which space is understood, at least in the lives of the migrant workers. Now, in terms of Yeats' Ort and migrant workers, I find it so difficult. But when you look at, when I showed you when I discussed the maps, for example, of when you look at the maps of South Africa, that's a kind of Yeats' Ort. You're looking at the map, but this map evokes the map of Palestine. So that's kind of shock experience, a Yeats' Ort experience. Or you look at the map of where American Indians are now marginalized and kept in small reservations, and then this brings to mind again in your thoughts the Palestinian experience, wherein where Palestinians are herded into these very small open air prisons of Gaza, right? And you will see the similarity with the maps that you see of the Americas, of where the tribes, the indigenous tribes of the United States are kept. So this is a Yeats' Ort experience, where a map evokes another map, or a place evokes another place, and it generates this kind of critical position, which is different from the critical position generated by the specter of comparisons.
All right, thank you, Sir Bowman. If we don't have any questions or any more comments, Sir Bowman, how can they reach you if they want to continue this conversation with you?
Ayun, doon sa email ko lang, no? Sa email ko. rgguillermo@up.edu.ph, no? If you're interested in looking further into Walter Benjamin, no? I can help you into this, no? Because I'm interested in developing these ideas. So you see, hindi ako nativist, no? Like, you know, but I use these ideas to go deeper into what we are.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. We can proceed now the next part of our program.
Salamat sa inyo. Salamat.
Thank you sa inyo, Sir Bowman. And so, we'd like to present the certificate of appreciation for Dr. Ramon Guillermo for sharing his valuable knowledge and expertise as plenary speaker with the topic just taught, Geographies in Transition at the ICGS 2023 with the theme Performative Geographies, Specialties of Embodiment, Performance, Ideology, and Practice, held November 24 to 25 in UP, Quezon City. The certificate is signed by our ICGS coordinators, Timothy James Cipriano and Maria Celeste Hermida, and also signed by the President of Philippine Geographical Society, Professor Emmanuel Garcia and Dr. Joseph Palis, the Chair of the Department of Geography. So once again, Sir Bowman, Prof. Guillermo, marami pong salamat. Thank you for taking the time. We know that you're busy and you still said yes and agreed to grace the occasion by sharing with us your insights. Thank you. And so we can move with the next slide. All right, so this is just a reminder for everyone. We still have a day 2 tomorrow, and watch out and tonight spend the time thinking about and planning which panel sessions you will attend tomorrow. But aside from that, we also have a PGS General Assembly by 3 in the afternoon, 3 to 5 p.m. And so we're hoping that a lot of you will decide to become members of the organization. We've provided you with the forms. Fill it up and send it back to us. And hopefully you'll be able to join us also for the assembly. Next slide, please. We will also be launching the PGJ Journal tomorrow, the 2022 issue. And this would also be a good opportunity if you would be able to stay and join us with the PGJ launching. Many of you might be interested also in submitting your articles, so please reach out to us. You know, the ICGS 2023 microsite, and you also know our social media pages, so reach out to PGS if you want to also contribute to the PGJ. Next slide, please. All right, so TJ already posted the link to the microsite, so please check that out. We're showing here the panel presentations for tomorrow. Please join us. We still have more sessions, no, in the morning and also in the afternoon. Okay. All right. So thank you again for all of you. You've been with us since earlier this morning. And so before we all go, we're hoping that people could turn on their cameras. So that we could have a photo with our guest speaker.